Professor Messamore, we left off when you were just about to get into the Quebec resolutions on slide 71.
Yes.
And I noticed that we have quite a few slides sort of detailing the resolutions. And I think in the interest of time, we're going to try and skip ahead to only the most relevant ones.
Right.
So maybe you could just at least describe for us what you're showing here on slide 71.
Yes, so I'm listing on slide 71 the specific powers that would be handled by what they term the general government,
And
by which we mean the Dominion or the federal government.
okay, thanks.
So it says powers to make laws for the peace, welfare, and good government of the federated provinces, saving the sovereignty of England, and especially laws respecting the following subjects. And then we have this long list of particular subjects that are to come under the jurisdiction of the
And
general government.
I should apologize. So we actually then started at slide 70, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, so slide 70 is the lead in that tells us that the following list is the list of the idea of what should be federal responsibilities.
Correct.
And I understand that carries on then to slide 72 as well.
Yes, let me just flip through here. Yes, it does. And
slide 73.
And slide 73.
All right. Then we get to slide 74.
Yes.
Where you have resolution 43. I guess this is 43 out of 72 resolutions. Is that?
That's correct.
And this one here, you have some highlighting. So I'll let you explain this one.
Yeah, so again, I didn't necessarily imagine that the court would want me to read off all of these individual powers, but I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that contrary to Galt's original scheme in 1858, that the Quebec resolutions placed the sale and management of public lands, excepting lands belonging to the general government, under the jurisdiction of the local legislatures.
And local.
Sorry, the provincial.
Provincial. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. So that was one important difference from the time of Galt's original plan to the actual Quebec resolutions themselves.
And slide 75 carries on with that list of items reserved for the provincial governments.
Correct.
And then we've got slide 76.
Yes. And slide 76 is just simply drawing attention to the point I just named, that public lands, according to Galt's original plan, would be held by the Dominion government with the net proceeds going to the provinces, but that had changed by the time the Quebec resolutions were drawn out, with public lands now coming under provincial jurisdiction.
Then I think we can also skip through resolution 54. It does not appear to be particularly relevant to your report or your conclusions. I take it you're just reproducing all of the financial related resolutions.
Yes, since I was asked to kind of particularly report on the financial arrangements at the time of Confederation, I thought it was best to be systematic and to name everything and let the court decide which things were of particular interest in this context.
So I'd like to jump ahead to, well, if we look very briefly at slide 78, there's another error that is mine in my teams in the resolution 55, it should be. And then 79 should be resolutions 56 and 59. And 56 looks like a relevant resolution. Can you tell us about this one?
Yes, so this is what would become section 109 in the British North America Act. It says that all lands, mines, minerals, and royalties vested in Her Majesty in the province of Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island for the use of such provinces shall belong to the local government of the territory in which the same are so situate, subject to any trusts that may exist in respect to any of such lands or to any interest of other persons in respect of the same.
Right, and you've said that this is a precursor really to section 109.
Yes.
So can we then go on to slide 80? And here I think resolution 60 is particular relevance.
Yes, so again, this section of the Quebec resolutions would correspond to 111 in the BNA Act, and then subsequently 112, and where the debt limits are articulated in the BNA Act. So resolution 60 says the general government shall assume all the debts and liabilities of each province. And then resolution 61 says the debt of Canada not specially assumed by Upper and Lower Canada respectively shall not exceed at the time of union 62,500,000. Nova Scotia shall enter the union with a debt not exceeding 8 million, and New Brunswick with a debt not exceeding 7 million. So in that case, that specifies the ceiling of the provincial debt for which the federal government would assume responsibility.
Right. Is there any other part of slide 80 that you think is relevant for us to go through now?
Well, I should just mention that for those provinces whose debt did not reach that debt ceiling, the understanding was that they would receive interest at the rate of 5% on amount of debt that hadn't been assumed by the Dominion government. So the amount not so incurred is what it says. Yeah, so the interest rate was set at 5%. So if they didn't reach that debt threshold, they wouldn't be penalized essentially. They would not be penalized. They would receive benefit based on not having that level of debt.
So are we seeing here that provinces like Upper and Lower Canada, which became named Ontario and Quebec, they were indebted to the Dominion government because they exceeded their debt allowance? They were charged interest at 5%.
Yeah, we should specify the province of Canada in that context. Sorry. Rather than Upper and Lower Canada. So, yes, because their debt exceeded their debt limit of 62,500,000, that additional debt would also be assumed by the Dominion government, but they, rather than receiving interest, would have to pay interest on the excess debt.
Right. So what I was going to get to then is the other provinces that didn't have debt up to their debt limit would actually receive from the federal government interest.
Correct. Yes.
Thank you. Interest.
Yeah, interest at 5%.
So on slide 81, you talk about other grants and aid to the provinces.
Slide 81?
Yes. Is this something that you can?
Yeah. Yes, so there were other financial arrangements beside the debt ceiling. I understand the thing that we're most interested in this context is the debt ceiling, but I thought, again, to make the whole picture complete, I should mention other elements here. So there would be a grant in aid to each province, according to the Quebec resolutions, equal to 80 cents per head of the population, as established by the census of 1861. And there was also a unique arrangement made for British Columbia, and it offers a rationale for that. I'm sorry, no, New Brunswick, sorry, New Brunswick, and offers a rationale for that. Sorry, I misspoke, New Brunswick. That because it says their position being such as to entail large immediate charges upon her local revenues, it is agreed that for a period of 10 years from the time when the union takes effect, I'm sorry, there's a typo there. It should say an additional allowance, not an additional allowance of $63,000 per annum shall be made to that province. But so long as the liability of that province remains under $7 million, a deduction equal to the interest on such deficiency shall be made from the $63,000. So I suppose the reason I provide this detail is that I think the general principle that's important to take away from this is equity between provinces. It did not always mean exactly equal treatment. There were a couple of instances in which local circumstances had to be taken into account. And when I misspoke, I suppose, and said British Columbia, that would later prove to be one of those other cases of such special circumstances.
Thank you. So slide 82, can you take us through that?
Yeah, and again, this is kind of my summary of it. I've said that these are the resolutions that are most relevant for present purposes.
These being the ones we just discussed?
Correct, yes. The financial provisions reached at the Quebec Conference were very similar to those that ultimately became part of the British North America Act. And in fact, within the debt allowance, they didn't change at all. It also seems to be the case, as Chancellor Boyd contended in his January 1898 reasons for his decision in Award 21, that the delegates at Quebec used the terms debts and liabilities interchangeably.
Can I interrupt? What Award 21 are you referring to here?
Of the Dominion Provincial Arbitration.
Which we'll get to later.
Yes, which we'll get to later, yes. So I've just simply made the observation that although there is no comprehensive and full official record of all discussion in the Confederation conferences, I've found no record that suggests there was ever a distinction made in the use of the terms debts and liabilities.
And why do you make this particular observation here?
Well, in fact, I was asked to. that was what
it goes back to, I guess, one of the questions you were asked about what the framers would have intended by this language.
Yes, yes.
The next set of slides deal with Galt's speech at Sherbrooke.
Yes.
And there's almost 20 slides on Galt's speech, which means almost 20 times that we reproduce the spelling error in Sherbrooke. So,
consistency being one of the principles today.
I apologize for that. Every time I look at it, it bothers me. But I do think we don't probably need to go through all of the slides on Galt's speech at Sherbrooke. So similar to the way that we handled the Quebec resolutions, we'll try to just work through the highlights. Perhaps you can tell us, though, from slide 83, give us a bit of an introduction as to what this speech was about and why it's important.
Yeah, well, I think it's important because, as I say, we have no direct record of the Confederation conferences themselves and what is discussed. But where it comes to the financial provisions, Galt was, I would suggest, the dominant mind behind those financial arrangements. And right on the heels of the Quebec conference, he gave this 3-hour speech, which I think is quite remarkable in a modern context to think about a speech to one's constituents lasting 3 hours and very rich in detail about those financial arrangements. But what's significant to me is that he explains the rationale behind the financial proposals. He sets out the general features of it. The same ideas are repeated in very similar language in his speech later in the Legislative Assembly during the debates on Confederation in 1865. So a fairly comprehensive explanation by the person whose mind I think was mostly responsible for these arrangements.
All right, it seems to me, page 84, you speak briefly about one of the benefits being the interchange of trade really between the provinces. And then 85, I think, if you could help go through slide 85 for us.
Well, I think, yeah, bearing in mind that it's, thinking contextually that he's giving a speech to his constituents in the province of Canada, he would be making a case for why, if there were any deviations from completely equal treatment in every case. He's trying to explain those. He's talking about New Brunswick, for example, having duties on the export of timber. That's a distinct circumstance. Nova Scotia had an export duty on coal, and that some concession was necessary to reflect that. Yeah, and so that's also, if I can go to the next slide, it's slide 86.
Yeah.
That kind of explains a little bit these points. So John Hamilton Gray, again from New Brunswick, who wrote about the Confederation arrangements, said that these were apparent exceptions to the fact that the federal government would have control over customs duties, but he described them as simply a more convenient mode therein. They're in use of, sorry, that must be wrong, simply a more convenient mode, essentially, of collecting royalties, an exception which would otherwise appear inconsistent. So because we, at least in the terms of the Quebec resolutions, it said that they would be permitted to retain the provinces of New Brunswick or actually they didn't specify, sorry, in the Quebec resolutions, I should correct myself, they didn't actually specify which province, but it said that local legislatures shall have the power. Sorry, this is on slide 87, the next slide, we should look at that. The local legislatures shall have the power respecting direct taxation on the imposition of duties on the export of timber, logs, masts, spars, deals, and sawn lumber, and of coals and other minerals. So that exception was made to take account of these distinct circumstances. And in Galt's speech, he's explaining to his constituents why this particular arrangement was made that seemed to deviate from the principle of exact equality.
All right.
That makes sense.
So it looks to me then slides 88 and 89 really follow up on this taxing power idea.
Yes.
I wonder if we could skip to slide 90 where you talk about debt, which I think is particularly relevant here.
It is, yeah. So he acknowledged there was a great deal of dispute with reference to the amount of public debt, and he offered what he described as an unquestionable and reliable account of the debt as prepared by the Auditor General. If we can go to slide 91.
It's 91. I mean.
It shows the, as of the 1st of January, 1864, the net liabilities of the province of Canada at 67,263,994, and then the debt of the other individual provinces.
Is the exact figure here important in any way?
No, I would say it isn't really, because it would change by the date of Confederation. And so I think that that's an important demonstration of the principle that this debt was going to be assumed by the Dominion government at whatever level it would ultimately land, and there'd be adjustments ever afterward for a long time to come. But the important thing is that the debt ceiling, the debt allowance for the province of Canada was 62,500,000, irrespective of the amount of actual debt.
All right. So that takes us to slide 92. I think you, this is a bit repetitive, I suppose.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So that Galt simply went over this concept of the debt ceiling to his Sherbrooke audience in the speech.
Okay.
And it specified that it was something like 5 million less than the nominal amount of the debt.
At that time.
At that time.
Can we look at slide 93?
Yeah, and slide 93 was really about kind of rationalizing how that debt ceiling figure was arrived at, how they could come to a per capita amount of debt ceiling for each individual province. And in the case of the province of Canada, that meant kind of leaving some of the local debt out of the equation. He said that way they were enabled to put the debt of Canada at the same rate per head as
Which
Nova
slide
Scotia
are you
and
looking at?
Brunswick. Sorry, slide 93.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
sorry. I wasn't seeing. Oh, I see where you're saying that. Yeah.
Should I read that or not?
Well, I'm interested in the middle, the phrase in the middle of this slide, where you mentioned that what Galt said, he felt it would be better that each province.
Should assume that portion of the debt which was particularly local and take
Just slow
Oh,
down.
I'm sorry. That it was better that each province should assume that portion of the debt which was particularly local and take with it those securities which it held for its redemption. Thus, Gulf explained, by assuming the local liabilities and assets, where you were enabled to put the debt of Canada at the same rate per head as Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. In this way, he said, the assumption of their debts by the general government did not offer any difficulty whatever. I wonder, sorry.
I guess that takes us then to slide 94, where you expand on this point about trying to equalize the per capita amount.
That's what
And
I was just about to
in
say.
94, are you going to tell me what 93 means?
I hope so.
Okay.
So it's about, I think 93 is about a mode of calculation for the Dominion government to assume provincial debt according to a per capita calculation for each province. And I think that, as I understand it, 93 reflects this idea that only some of the provincial debt went into that calculation. 62,500,000 did not reflect all of the province of Canada's debt.
There was that Canada's debt exceeded
Sorry,
62.5 million.
correct. Yeah, the province of Canada's debt. Yeah, that's
Right.
right. And so in slide 94, he says that if there had been any huge discrepancy in the debt of any individual province, that would have posed a difficulty. But he's saying it was found that while the province of Canada's debt might be reduced by the mode he had stated to 62,500,000, or nearly as possible $25 a head. So again, I'd say reduced by the mode he stated. We're talking about kind of a calculation, a nominal calculation of the debt ceiling and not the actual debt, I think would be how we might understand this, that Nova Scotia had debt of 8 million, which worked out to $25 a head roughly. And these are again, rough approximations. New Brunswick had debt of approximately 7 million, which was, Galt said, a fraction above the $25 per head debt of Nova Scotia and Canada. So I think what these are all about is how did they arrive at the debt ceiling amount? And they kind of used, I suppose, Nova Scotia as essentially the model, and worked from that basis. Once they had a per capita figure of $25, that was applied to the other provinces as well. Is that no?
Well, I don't know what
No.
that was applied to. What did they
Oh.
say? Canada or province of Canada will accept your debt so long as it's around $25 works out to $25 per person. Or, as I was trying to understand, slide 93, were they excluding from the calculation of debt, something, those items that had a security attached to them. So that's why I asked if there was an explanation of 93 somewhere.
I would say that no, that was not a principle for exclusion. I think what they're trying to do is find a rationale for using a debt ceiling for the province of Canada that would be equal to that of the debt ceiling of Nova Scotia on a per capita basis, right?
Okay.
And I find, I'll confess, I find Galt's explanation a bit murky there. It's a speech that I think it's more important, at least I believe, to think about what was the formula. And the formula amounted to $25 per head, roughly, consistently applied by using the figure 62,500,000 for the province of Canada.
Sorry,
And-
the formula being the formula to find the ceiling per province.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And I do a little later in the slides kind of articulate the principles a little more clearly, I think, but I thought it was important to kind of have Galt's explanation of them, even though there are some things that are sometimes a little murky in his explanation.
Can we move to slide 95?
Yes. So you will know, I think that initially, at least, Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland were not part of the original Confederation, but their entry was contemplated by the Quebec terms, and they had to take account of their differing circumstance. Galt, in his speech, explained that each had a more insular experience, ready access to water transportation, so neither had incurred large infrastructure expenses, which of course would mean railway expenses primarily, or canal building expenses. So their debt was found to be much less proportionately. And so Galt explained that if we treated them, or to place them on a par with the other provinces, with the province of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, it therefore became necessary to give them indemnity for the amount of debt that they hadn't incurred, because in assuming the revenues, we called upon them to contribute to the payment of the interest on the debt which we had incurred, and we could not fairly expect them to do so unless they were in some measure indemnified for it. So in simple terms, I think what he's saying here is that their debt is going to be significantly less than the other provinces, and this is why that 5% would be allowed for debt that for amounts under that debt ceiling. So if they hadn't debt that met the per capita allowance, they would receive interest on the sum that they hadn't used of that
From the
debt.
Dominion.
From the Dominion, yes. Yeah.
But in fact, Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland didn't actually join Confederation, so
Correct.
this didn't play out in the actual BNA Act.
Yes, that's right.
I
Yeah, and I
wonder-
think slide 96 kind of elaborates a little bit.
I was going to suggest, actually, knowing that Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland didn't end up joining, I wondered whether we could skip over some of these slides and really go to slide 100, I think, is where we get to.
Yeah, there's only one thing, I suppose, on slide 97 that might
Okay.
be noteworthy, and it's not hugely important for our purposes. But again, because Galt is making the case that, making a case for Confederation to his constituents, he's explaining to them that we're not going to be in entering into this Confederation taking on a great burden of other colonies that they don't require our support, essentially, was the case that he was making. So that was, I think, the only point that he also said, sorry, on 99, if we can just take one step back, that he was not going to enter into the thing that would ultimately become the Section 142 arbitration and what portion would be assumed for the province of Canada's debt by the respective provinces of Quebec and Ontario, if that makes sense. But he does, yeah, so yeah, that's essentially that he's not going to address that point. Yeah.
He's not going to address it.
In his speech, he wasn't going to, yes, yeah. He understood that would have to be worked out.
Can we move to slide 100?
This is where Galt explains the per capita subsidy. And in this case, so that per capita subsidy was 80 cents per capita. And he's making a case, I suppose, for equal treatment. He says that we use Nova Scotia as an example. They estimated what would be required for what he calls the machinery of government. Was 80 cents per capita. That would be a subsidy to be paid by the Dominion government to each provinces. So one form of provincial, or sorry, of federal assistance, if you like, was the debt ceiling, the assumption of debt up to a certain ceiling. Another was a per capita payment of 80 cents. And in making this point about equality, he says for Upper Canada, meaning I guess the province of Canada in this context, this amount amounted to considerably more than what was required. But it was felt that in giving a subsidy from the public chest, as in the general government, it was the Dominion government, it was impossible to draw a distinction between one part of the country or another. I suppose meaning that there was no theory under which they could reasonably pay a different per capita subsidy in the provinces of Ontario and Quebec than they did to other provinces. So that again is maybe not essential to this point, but I felt that if I was talking about the financial arrangements in general, I had to mention it, that the debt ceiling was only one of those financial arrangements, but there were others, right?
And the subsidy was to be equally applied.
The per capita subsidy, yes, of 80 cents, yes.
Thank you.
So slide 101, you have specific figures. Is it necessary to go through those?
Not for my purposes.
All right, I think we can skip that as well. But starting on slide 102, you get into your commentary
Yes.
on what you believe are the core ideas from Galt's explanations, and I'd like you to take us through those.
Yes, that's correct. This is my commentary. My inference is drawn from this material. One, I think this is a fairly important idea, is that the Dominion's assumption of provincial debt was not envisaged as open-ended. It was a matter of precise calculation, limited and specific. The debt allowance that was worked out was roughly based on Nova Scotia's per capita debt, $25 per head. And in the case of the province of Canada, the debt allowance was calculated, leaving some debt associated with local purposes out of the equation to keep it within that $25 limit. So each province had a specific debt allowance with interest payable by the province on debt assumed by the Dominion that exceeded that ceiling, and interest payable to the province if their debt level fell below it. So I think it's important maybe to draw attention to that point, that there was a specific calculated debt allowance It didn't represent all the debt, and indeed it might have in some cases exceeded the debt, but it was a matter of precise calculation, roughly based on $25 per head.
And although this may not be important, and you can tell me if it is, by leaving it out of the calculation, if that's what you say, is that it remains a debt of the province of Canada agreed that it would remain their debt and it wouldn't be assumed?
No, I don't think that's exactly what was meant by that. I think that all the debt was assumed, but the province would be paying interest on that debt assumed that exceeded the debt ceiling. What I meant by leaving it out of the calculation was arriving at a consistent per capita figure, some rationale, I suppose, for setting this at 62,500,000 and saying that the province of Canada's nominal debt was 62,500,000, when in fact it wasn't. It was higher than that, but that was the 62,500,000 was the debt ceiling.
So maybe smoke and mirrors?
Yeah, that would be a good way to describe it. Yes. And I think, I believe that principle will become clearer as we go through some examples of maybe smoke and mirrors dealing with other provinces where circumstances were materially different, but there had to be a rationale to fall into the principle of consistent treatment. I hope that that's so. I
just wanted to,
yeah.
just to get to this idea of the debt allowance. So you've told us that the Dominion assumed all of the debt of the province of Canada. Let's say it was 69 million, just for argument.
Yeah, it very nearly was.
But under the terms of Confederation, effectively, Canada, the Dominion, would essentially forgive 52,500,000 of that.
62 million.
62,500,000 would effectively be forgiven. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. That was the province's debt ceiling. That was the amount the Dominion government would assume. Assume liability for. Yes, they would assume more, but in assuming more, the province would then be paying interest on that 5%, and was understood that that liability remained with the province for debt that exceeded their ceiling.
Can I then say another term that's used besides debt ceiling is debt allowance?
Yes.
And if you think of it as a debt allowance, you could think that the Dominion government is allowing really forgiving the province of Canada from having to pay the 62,500,000. But if there's any more debt above that, then the Dominion is saying to the province of Canada, you're going to have to pay this. You're going to be liable for it. And you got to pay interest on that at 5% per year.
That's
Is that
correct.
correct? And in fact, these ideas were ultimately adopted in the BNA Act.
Yes, they were. Yeah, this part of the debt allowance didn't change by the time the BNA Act was drawn up.
Would it be helpful, Justice Hennessy, to look back at that section 112, section 111?
No, I think I understand that. It's what this meant, what this consider it a local matter meant. But if there is an allowance or there's a ceiling, we'll assume the debt up to 62.5, and any debt over that we have assumed, because we're assuming all debts, you the province pay interest on it.
And
yes.
And perhaps those debts that are considered above the 62,500,000 are debts of a local nature. Would that be fair?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's all debt we're talking about for any purpose, right? So I think that Galt's explanation is murky. It's a bit confusing. I think the important thing is that debt of the province incurred for any reason is going to be assumed by the Dominion government, but their allowance for debt assumed, allowance meaning debt for which the Dominion government assumes responsibility and the province would have no obligation to pay interest, was 62,500,000.
Thank you. But, and then if I understood correctly,
Mhm.
make this more unclear, is it that was a rolling 60, a rolling ceiling?
No, the
It
ceiling.
was one time,
The ceiling was fixed and remained fixed, yes.
but it was a
Yeah.
one time?
Yeah, so, yeah, so debt was assumed up to 62,500,000, and that debt never changed. If new debts were discovered, for example, and added to the province account, so if there had been something that was an obligation of the province of Canada that arose from the pre-Confederation era and had to be settled, what would happen was the Dominion government would pay that amount. That didn't change the debt ceiling, it remained fixed. But the province would be liable for and obligated to pay interest on that additional amount. I should, specify one thing. There would be an adjustment to all the provinces subsequently in 1873, and I get into that, but that was the only time, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Messamore. That's actually what I was going to ask you to speak about, because you did say that there had been it was a fixed amount, but in fact,
Right.
there was a change.
There
at one
was an
time,
adjustment for and consistently applied to all.
and we'll get to that later.
Yes, we will.
Great.
Thank you.
Continuing on with your take on the core ideas from Galt's explanations, I think we're at slide 103.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the first is just a general comment about Confederation that I've said the so-called fathers of Confederation had competing ambitions and intentions about the structure of Federation. John A. Macdonald envisaged a highly centralized Canada, while others emphasized that the new plan would break apart the unworkable Union of 1840, freeing Ontario and Quebec, which of course we understand have been locked in this political deadlock, but it frees them to pursue greater autonomy. So it's, to me, I just make that observation because it's interesting to see the various visions of what this agreement actually represented. Was it a marriage or a divorce is one analogy I sometimes use. And I suppose for the maritime colonies, it was a marriage of sorts. For the province of Canada, it was more in the nature of divorce because they were broken out of that unworkable union of 1840, and now each would have its own local provincial legislature. So I just mention that because we're talking about Confederation generally, and that those varying interpretations of the nature of Confederation were present from the outset. But the other point that I think is important to take away is, despite these differences, the financial aspects of Confederation remained consistent, and there was generally little disagreement over this point. There would be times, of course, when provinces would push for greater federal subsidies and things like that, but I don't think anyone actually disputed how these financial arrangements were understood.
Can I just ask, you've described before Galt's explanation as a little bit murky, and yet you also say there was a high degree of consistency in how his arrangements were understood. Can you explain?
I suppose they're murky Galt's explanations are murky insofar as his explanation of the rationale for the debt ceiling or the debt allowance is a bit murky. But there was no question about what those debt allowances actually were and how they functioned, I think.
So that takes us to slide 104, which really, I guess, just summarizes what then happened.
Yes, it does. Yes. So we have in July 1866, because of course the British North America Act would have to be a piece of British legislation. We have British authorities preparing the draft of the BNA Act based upon the 1864 Quebec resolutions. In December of that year of 1866, a conference of delegates from the British North American colonies met in London to determine the final terms. That again was in closed meetings with a view to encouraging candor. The resulting bill passed both houses of the British Parliament in 1867, received royal assent on the 29th of March, 1867.
That takes us to the next part of your historical outline, which is number 4, the management of debts at the time of Confederation, 1867. That starts on slide 106. And here you're talking about the final terms of the British North America Act. Can you take us through that?
Yes, and again, I thought it was important to put the debt allowance in a wider context to explain that that was one of 4 types of financial aid to the provinces. So under section 118 was the per capita subsidy of 80 cents to be paid to each province based upon the 1861 census. And there was a provision that for Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, the per capita grant, I should point out, I'm sorry, that the original provinces were Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario. But for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, the per capita grant was to increase with the population until each province reached 400,000 in population. And in the same section in 118, this part was new in the BNA Act. It wasn't part of the Quebec resolutions. There would be a grant for the maintenance of government and legislature and the legislature of each province. So $80,000 for Ontario, $70,000 for Quebec, $60,000 for Nova Scotia, $50,000 for New Brunswick.
And then on slide 107.
And the third type of financial aid was the debt allowance. Section 111 of the British North America Act said that Canada shall be liable for the debts and liabilities of each province existing at the Union.
And I'll interrupt you there to say now the use of the word Canada
refers to the Dominion.
Thank you.
Yes.
I would like to go back if we
Mhm.
could. When you just started with or you just went back to the 4 types of financial aid.
Uh-huh.
And on 107, you have the third type being the debt allowance. I originally thought the debt allowance was the first one, so maybe I got lost somewhere.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess if I just use that language. Yeah, I
Maybe you can just name them for me, if you
yes,
don't mind.
yes, okay.
So I think the first 2 of the 4 are listed on slide 106. Can you tell us what those are again?
Yes, on slide, yeah, so yeah, again, using the term first is probably not accurate. It's not in sequence in the British North America Act. I suppose I mentioned these out of sequence because I wanted to dispatch with some
No,
of them
it's okay.
quickly.
Just give me 4 kinds.
So under section 118 is the per capita subsidy of 80 cents per province based on the 1861 census. Also under 118 is a different kind of subsidy, which is a grant for the.
Is that a second kind? Is that the second?
Yes, I
type?
would say so because it's a dollar amount rather than a per capita amount for each province.
So in your slides, Professor Messamore, these are the first 2 of the 4 that you're going through.
Yes, that's correct. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then on slide 107, you go to the 3rd type.
Yeah, I call it the third type, but technically it isn't really listed third in the
Okay.
BNA Act, but it is the thing that I would devote most of my attention to, which was the debt allowance. So section 111 in which we said that Canada shall be liable for the debts and liabilities of each province existing at the Union.
Okay,
And then 112 specifies the debt allowance of the province of Canada was 62.5 million. 114 specified the debt allowance of Nova Scotia was 8 million.
no, I'm just looking for the fourth kind,
Oh, I'm
It's the
sorry.
next slide, then we can skip ahead to 108.
if you're okay.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, the fourth kind was unique to New Brunswick, and that was an additional special annual subsidy for $63,000 for 10 years. So that was for New Brunswick alone. Did I say New Brunswick?
Yes, you
think-
did.
Yeah, sorry.
And I see at the bottom of that slide 108, you say the fourth type of financial aid. Is this one under section?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
here, now we've got is it 116 or 119?
Section
Um,
119.
Oh, yeah, no, so section 116 specifies in case the public debts of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick do not amount to 8 million and 7 million. This is the provision for interest that they would be
Oh, okay.
entitled to receive. So I consider that sort of still part of that calculation of debt ceiling allowance. And then the fourth type is distinct, which is that special 10-year grant for New Brunswick of 63,000.
Okay.
Yeah, so per capita subsidy 80 cents, allowance sort of annually for the maintenance of government, debt allowance, and the special subsidy to New Brunswick would be the four, not necessarily in that order.
I think that then takes us to slide 109, where you talk about section 142 of the Constitution, which is particularly relevant for this case. Can you
Yes,
take
it
us through
is.
that?
Yeah, so section 42,
100.
section 142 dealt with apportioning the the debts, credits, liabilities, properties, and assets of Upper and Lower Canada. So providing for the arbitration of the matter. So the all these assets and liabilities that had been collectively those of the province of Canada, as it existed after 1840, would now have to be allocated according to some basis to Ontario and to Quebec. And so section 142 provides for an arbitration process with Ontario and Quebec, each appointing an arbitrator and a third not resident in either province to be appointed by the Dominion government. So the section 142 was about that arbitration process.
Thank you. Is the reporter in court prepared to go a little bit longer?
Okay,
Okay, continue on a few more slides. Thank you. So now we're at slide 110. You mentioned the London conference changes.
Yeah, I just mentioned that, I guess, with a view to scrutinizing what changed from the time of the Quebec conference. So one being at the London conference, when Britain scrutinized these resolutions, that it was decided that the 80-cent per capita subsidy wouldn't remain forever fixed, but would for Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, be adjusted with population increases until the population reached 400,000. And so, yeah.
I was just going to say, I'll stop you there. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because earlier when you went through the four types and you'd said that there was this 80% per capita, and you mentioned something about this adjusted for population increases. So I'm glad you're now explaining that that was added.
That was introduced at the stage of the London conference.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah. And also, I think I did mention that the addition of annual grants for each province for the supported government and legislatures was also added at that stage at the London conference.
And that was number 2 of the 4 different types of financial aid you told us about.
It was one of the 4. Was it number 2? I
Yeah,
can't
it was
recall.
number
Yeah. And I guess my point in bringing this up, I suppose, was that the terms remained quite consistent from the time of the Quebec resolutions to the ultimate draft of the BNA Act. And any sort of change was closely scrutinized. I mentioned George Brown's Globe attacking these changes, the fear being that introduction of any changes would spark further demands for concessions to the provinces. So I just felt it was sort of important to emphasize that most things remained consistent. These were examples of a couple of minor changes, but the debt allowance did not change at all. And I think I might address that on the following slide. I'm not sure
Yes,
if I do.
slide 111, this appears to be your opinion of your interpretation of the previous slides. Can you take us through that?
It is, yeah. So I just say that the specific and limited nature of the provincial debt allowance as established in these final terms is clearly demonstrated by the fact that in the interval from 1864, those conferences, to the actual passage of the Act in 1867, the actual indebtedness of the provinces increased, but the debt allowance did not. The figure that was agreed upon in 1864 based on the 1861 census figures didn't change. The debt allowance remained consistent, although the amount of actual debt did not.
Thank you. So going on to slide 112, you have an example from Nova Scotia.
Yes, yeah. So I'm not sure how important this is, but it's just kind of making the point that a historian of Nova Scotia has observed the degree to which Nova Scotia's debt increased in the intervening years. But Charles Tupper, a Nova Scotia delegate, who would later be a prime minister, recognized that he wasn't going to obtain any substantial change in the debt allowance. And he instead focused on securing increases to the subsidy based on increasing population, that idea that it would go up to, be adjusted up to $400,000. I think he recognized that the debt allowance was inviolate, if you like, that it was.
You said $400,000. I think
I'm
you
sorry,
meant
400,000 people
people.
is, I'm sorry, what I meant to say, yes. Yeah.
Do I understand that the debt allowance by this time can be better expressed as $25 per capita?
Yes, although that would be a rough figure.
Okay,
And-
but a per capita, I don't need to know
Oh,
a number,
yes, exactly.
a per capita count.
Yes.
So when you
um,
say the debt increased,
Yes,
the debt allowance did not, it was some rough version of 25, of some rough version of a per capita amount.
yes, but again, I guess I would say per capita as of the 1861 census. So when the
So-
population increased, the debt allowance did not increase accordingly. That would be an important addition to that.
So then the debt, when you say the debt, sorry, when you say the actual indebtedness of the provinces to third parties or to the Dominion?
I'm sorry, to the Dominion.
And how did it increase? Oh, it increased subject to, it was subject to interest.
Well, it actually, it increased because an amount was agreed upon at the Confederation conferences in 1864, saying, I should maybe backtrack for a second and say, I think it's more meaningful to talk in terms of dollar amounts than per capita.
Okay,
To say that it was 62,500,000 for the province of Canada.
I'm just going to be helpful to the reporter.
Oh.
62.5 is a lot
Thank
less
you,
typing.
of course. Thank you. 62.5 for the province of Canada, 8 million for Nova Scotia, and 7 million for New Brunswick. And the reason I prefer that to per capita is because it remained fixed. And of course, the population didn't remain fixed, right? The
Right.
population increased. And that population increase affected one form of financial aid. It affected the per capita subsidy, the 80 cents per capita that was paid, but it didn't affect the debt allowance. And so for that reason, I guess I would prefer to think of the debt allowance as that fixed sum.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you say the actual indebtedness of the province to the
Yes.
Dominion increased, we are talking then about an amount that exceeded the 62.5 million
Yes.
and
the-
which attracted interest.
Yeah, so in the case of the province of Canada, their debt at the time of the Confederation conferences in 1864 was already in excess of 62.
Okay, but I'm just trying to understand that comment. It's just, that's a part of the debt that because it exceeded the ceiling,
Yes,
it attracted interest.
yes, that's correct. And I guess also my point in drawing attention to this is the amount of the debt allowance was worked out in 1864, roughly based on per capita debt at that time. But the actual debt by the time of Confederation in 1867 was higher, but that debt allowance figure, that 62.5 million, didn't change.
Okay.
And then this is something I'll get into later in my testimony, but if older obligations were discovered that would affect that total amount of debt of the province of Canada, it would be added to the provincial debt account. So even after Confederation, the actual amount of debt doesn't remain fixed. There'd be adjustments for things, and including, as Your Honor mentioned, interest and things that it would affect the total amount of indebtedness. So for that reason, I think it's most helpful to think of the debt allowance as a fixed dollar amount.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So starting at page 113, you have included some statements. And this is one of the documents that I actually included in the compendium if anyone felt it would be helpful to look at the actual table. I'm wondering, do we need to take a look at Donald Creighton's statement? Can you first describe for us what is Donald Creighton's statement and how is it relevant here?
Yeah, I mean, we do get into a lot of detail, and it certainly is not essential to my purposes that we go over all of the figures. I think what's important here is that Donald Creighton, a very prominent Canadian historian, had prepared this study of British North America at Confederation for a royal commission launched in 1937, and ultimately he produced his report in 1939. And again, thinking contextually, as historians ought to do, I think it was important to understand that Royal Commission was prepared in the midst of the Great Depression. And the question was being contemplated on, what the financial arrangements in Confederation were, in part because the burden of relief fell upon those junior levels of government that were least equipped to cover it. So that was kind of the context, I think, in which Donald Creighton's statement was prepared. It's useful for our purposes, I suppose, or it was useful, I should say, for my purposes, because it provided exact figures of some of these debts and assets. And he provides figures, as he said, as they were assumed by the Dominion at the moment of entry of the different provinces into Confederation, figures for debt included. So statements done as of that date, prepared later, will show slightly different figures because they allowed for later adjustments. He gives a net debt on the 30th of June, 1867 for the province of Canada at just over 74 million. Can we go to, sorry.
And just to
Mhm.
reiterate, so
Mhm.
under section 111 of the BNA Act, the Dominion becomes liable for that full debt of 74 million. Is that correct?
Yes, with,
But
but important, yeah, with the province assuming liability for the amount that exceeded 62.5 million.
and when you say the province assuming liability, that means the province is then indebted to the Dominion to pay that excess.
Yes,
And obviously, they don't have the cash to pay it then and there. That's
Yes.
why they're in debt.
Mhm.
So instead of paying the Dominion that amount up front, they pay interest. Is that correct?
correct. They paid interest at the rate of 5%. And had their debt not reached that debt allowance, they would have received interest on the difference between the debt allowance and the actual amount of debt assumed by the Dominion government.
Thank you. So did you actually want to take us through Donald Creighton's statement? I think you've told us, I think the relevant point on slide 113 was that the province of Canada's debt, changed depending on when you were looking at it, but was
Yes.
roughly 74 million.
Yes, and I don't consider it necessary to go through these unless the court would like me to, but I just thought it would be helpful to have available the actual calculations that were done. I mean, for my purposes, what would make sense would be to go to slide 119
Right.
that begins to talk about the principle of equity in the financial arrangements.
Right. And I was just going to say, how are we
Oh,
doing for
sorry.
time? Yeah, well, that's a great place to start again. We'll start again at
Okay.
119 after break.
Thank you very much.
Ron?